And I'm going to do my best, so hang on to your hat here. Tui asked me to talk about ASA, Army Security Agency. It's not well known, but we were pretty much everywhere, so I'll try to explain that a little bit. And I also feel obligated to say that I will have some personal remarks, and I will point those out as I go along here. But everybody who has a security clearance that leaves service is debriefed and promises not to divulge any confidential information. So everything that I talk about here is stuff that I found on the internet or read in books, magazines, and so on. Now, I've tried to represent a lot of the war, and as you can see, we've got everything from, from religion. I'll talk about that for just a couple of minutes. Demonstrations against the war. There were some demonstrations for the war. Agent Orange, helicopters. My God, what a helicopter war. And a lot of you people, I'm sure, similar to me, every time I hear a helicopter rotor, my mind goes straight to the UH-1 Huey in Vietnam. The civilians, got a picture there, shows some of the terror, the life they lived while we were at war in Vietnam. And a couple of personal pictures here. But religion, let me talk about that just half a minute. Religion played a big part in the war because the president at the time, the early part of the war, was Diem, Nguyen Diem, and he was Catholic. And once he had the American full support, then he felt free to begin persecuting Buddhists, who were the majority in Vietnam, and I believe still are. So that didn't work real well. There was problems there. And to gain worldwide attention, one Buddhist monk did the trick. He placed himself in a busy Saigon intersection, doused himself with gasoline, and torched himself, self-immolation. And that created a firestorm around the world. How can the United States support a regime that persecutes its own people and causes this kind of thing? So that was when the administration, President Kennedy at the time, told the military that it was okay with him, in so many words, I understand, to replace Diem because he did have a lot of enemies, he was corrupt and so on. So the military did, the Vietnamese military did a coup, but they not only replaced him, but they killed him. They assassinated him, which gave us another black eye. And that, I believe historians will argue, is how we broke and bought Vietnam. We were there for the duration at that point. But going back, back in the day, when I was trying to get high school past me with a diploma that was signed, didn't know what I wanted to do, where I wanted to go. So I knocked on the door of my next best friend, Sergeant Sprague, the local recruiter. And he talked to me and he said, Paul, he said, boy, you're an ideal candidate for ASA, Army Security Agency. Well, what's that, Sergeant Sprague? And he said, well, I can't tell you it's classified. But he said, I think it has to do with electronics and it's spying, it's getting information from the enemy, it's cloak and dagger stuff, you'd love it. And of course, right away, I'm thinking, if I look in a mirror, I'm going to see something that looks like James Bond here. So I was very interested, but he told me not everybody can get into ASA. You have to be able to pass their tests, which are pretty difficult, and you have to get a top secret security clearance. But I was able to do that, and he said, oh, a couple of other things. I said, well, what about this thing that's going on the other side of the world? This little country, I think we've got some Marines there now, and the first air cav. Vietnam, he says. Don't you worry about Vietnam. By the time you're done with your extensive training, Vietnam will be in the rear view mirror. We'll be done with that business, don't you worry. We drew our line in the sand, and that's going to be the end of that. Also, he said, there is no ASA in Vietnam. And I questioned that at the time, but I remember specifically asking that question and him answering that way. And technically it's true. I've got a little visual of that. I've got a miniature poster, recruitment poster of the time, an actual poster, which says, it's Uncle Sam saying, I want you for ASA, enlist now. And in smaller letters on the bottom, It says, "No ASA in Vietnam." Now, I can tell you from personal experience, I didn't read this, this is personal. If you're in an ASA unit and you're headed for Vietnam, your unit designation changed from ASA to radio research. No ASA in Vietnam. But ASA was there the whole time, or radio research, whichever. And one of the greater needs that flowed all the way through the war was radio direction finding. And I've got it symbolized here, which is quite simple. If you have an effective army, you've got good communication. So if you can find out where the communication is coming from, that's where the enemy is. And I show enemy transmitter as a Viet Cong flag here. The transmission is going out, and if you have 3 receivers, special receivers that can find the direction that transmission is coming from, you can simply plot the point of intersection, and that's where the enemy is. At least that's where the enemy transmitters are. In fact, in 1965, President Johnson mentioned in a speech that the first combat casualty in Vietnam, which was 1961, was an ASA member, Specialist Davis, Spec 4 Davis, and he was heading one of these teams. Let's see, what else could I tell you? Also, ASA, or radio research, performed signal or communications intelligence. In other words, actually capturing the communication, analyzing it, and using it to our best advantage. And also communication security, which was doing what we could to prevent the enemy from doing to us, in terms of communication, what we were doing to them. At the time, this was the Cold War, so we had the Soviet Union, we had Red China, and communism was getting larger and bigger around the world, so we had ASA field stations around the world. Korea, Japan, Germany, Turkey, any number of places, but they were big installations. In Vietnam, however, we also had small ASA units that directly supported infantry units. And I was a part of the 199th Light Infantry Brigade, which was a very good unit. And if you're interested, you can look it up on the internet and probably be a little surprised by their record. I've got a couple personal pictures here of myself in fire support bases and forward areas on missions. I've got some different comments here you might find interesting. You can look at that yourself. But the last thing I'd like to point out is the sniper picture. In the bottom right there are 4 newly trained snipers of the 199th Light Brigade. And I would ask you to look at those bright, shiny faces, smiling, happy. They've just been trained. They've got a license to kill. And I'm sure that day they could have looked in a mirror and seen John Wayne or Audie Murphy, something like that. But I would also ask you to look forward. If they survive to this day, some of them, I'm sure war looks to them much different now than it did that day the picture was taken. So if anybody has any questions or wants to come up and talk about any of this, take a look. I'm available. Thank you very much.
Thank you.